The scream came from the north paddock, and Nadia Voss was already running before she understood why. A stable hand named Owen had been thrown 10 feet through the air. He landed hard against the fence rail, and the black horse that threw him reared again, front hooves cutting the morning air like blades. Nobody moved to help Owen. Everyone was too busy backing away from the horse. Nadia had been on the estate for exactly 6 minutes. She dropped her travel bag in the dirt and climbed over the fence before anyone could stop her. A woman in a gray coat shouted her name, telling her to wait, telling her it was not safe. But Nadia had stopped listening to that particular warning a long time ago. Warnings like that had followed her through every stable she had ever worked in. She had learned to hear them as background noise. The horse was enormous, black as wet stone, with a scar along his left shoulder that told its own story. His eyes were wide and white-rimmed, and his breath came out in short, furious bursts. He was not being cruel. Nadia could see that immediately. He was terrified, and terrified animals did not know the difference between defense and attack. Nobody had taught this horse the difference. Somebody had only ever taught him to be afraid. She did not walk toward him. She walked toward Owen first, staying low, keeping her body angled sideways so the horse would not read her as a threat closing in. Owen was groaning, holding his arm, but he was breathing. And breathing was the only thing that mattered in that first minute. She helped him back over the fence herself, ignoring the stinging in her palms from the rough wood. Only then did she turn to face the horse. He had stopped rearing. He stood in the center of the paddock, muscles trembling under his skin, watching her with an intensity that most people would have called dangerous. Nadia called it something else. She called it intelligence. A stupid animal did not track a stranger's every movement with that kind of focus. A stupid animal simply ran, or simply fought. This horse was doing neither. He was deciding. She lowered herself to the ground, sitting cross-legged in the dirt, 20 feet away from him, and she said nothing at all. She simply became still, and let the stillness be the only message she sent. Behind her, a new voice arrived, deep, controlled, carrying the particular weight of a man who was used to being obeyed the instant he spoke. Get away from him. Nadia did not turn around. Get away from who? She asked. The horse, or you? There was a pause behind her, the kind of pause that told her the man was not accustomed to being answered that way. She kept her eyes on the horse. His ears had flicked forward at the sound of the new voice, then back toward her, as if he too were trying to decide which one of them was more likely to be trouble. I am Cale Draven, the voice said. This is my land, and that is my horse, and I am telling you to step back before he kills you the way he nearly killed my last 2 men. Nadia finally turned her head, just enough to see him. He was tall, dressed simply for a man who apparently owned everything within sight, with a jaw set hard enough to crack walnuts and eyes the color of storm water. He looked like a man who had never once in his life been told no, and meant it. She was about to become the first. If you wanted him handled the easy way, she said, you would have shot him already. You didn't. That tells me something. It tells me you don't actually want him dead. You want him fixed. And you can't fix an animal by proving to him that every human on this land is the same threat wearing a different face. Cale's jaw tightened. You have no idea what you are talking about. I have every idea what I am talking about, she said. That is why I am here. She stood up slowly, brushing the dirt from her knees, and for the first time she looked directly at him instead of at the horse. Something passed between them in that look, something neither of them had a name for yet, something that felt less like attraction and more like recognition. 2 people who had both spent their lives being underestimated by people who thought strength only came in one shape. The horse behind her let out a low sound, something between a snort and a sigh, and took one small step closer to where she had been sitting, not toward Cale, toward her. Cale noticed. His eyes flicked from the horse to Nadia and back again, and something in his expression shifted from anger into something more careful. His name is Wrath, he said finally, as if offering information instead of a command for the first time in the conversation. He has broken the arm of one man and the leg of another. My counsel wants him put down. I refuse to do it, and I do not fully understand why I refuse, except that every time I look at him I feel like I am looking at something that was made wrong by people, not by nature. Nadia felt something in her chest tighten at that. It was, without question, the most honest sentence a stranger had ever said to her in the first 5 minutes of meeting. Then you called the right person, she said. Because I don't tame horses, Mr. Draven. Taming is what you do to something wild that never had a choice in the matter. What I do is different. I listen until the animal decides on its own that listening back is worth the risk. He studied her for a long moment. Behind them, Wrath had gone still. watching the two humans as if some invisible negotiation were happening that concerned him directly, which it was. "You have 1 month," Kale said. "If nothing changes, I will have to make a decision I do not want to make, and I will not pretend that decision will be pleasant for anyone, including you." 1 month is enough, Nadia said. "If you stop having your men force him into things and start letting me work. I do not need soldiers standing at the fence with ropes. I need quiet and patience, and for you to trust a process you do not understand yet." Kale's eyes narrowed slightly, and for the first time something like the ghost of respect moved across his face, quickly hidden but not quickly enough. "Trust is not something I hand out to strangers." "Good," Nadia said. "I would not trust you either if you did. Trust that comes too easily is worth nothing. Earn it the way I plan to earn Wrath's, and we will get along fine." She turned back to the horse before Kale could answer. He remained where he was, standing in the cool morning air, watching a woman he had known for less than 10 minutes speak to his damaged, dangerous horse, in a tone he had never once used with anything in his life. Not his advisors, not his soldiers, not even himself. Gentle, but immovable. Soft, but with steel underneath it that made the softness mean something. He should have walked away. There were council matters waiting for him inside, papers requiring his signature, a kingdom that did not pause its demands simply because a stranger with dirt on her knees had shown up at his stable. But he stood at the fence a moment longer than he needed to, and told himself it was because he needed to be certain the horse would not attack her. That was not the real reason, and some quiet, honest part of him already knew it. By midday, word of the confrontation had spread through the entire estate the way news always did in a place with too many idle staff and too few real events to talk about. The stranger who stood up to Wrath. The stranger who spoke back to the king as if his title meant nothing to her. Some of the staff whispered that she was either the bravest person they had ever met, or the most foolish, and most of them agreed she was probably both at once. Nadia ignored all of it. She had learned early in her career that reputation followed her whether she wanted it to or not, and the only thing that mattered was the work in front of her. She spent the rest of that first day simply sitting near the paddock fence, at a careful distance, doing nothing that could be mistaken for training. She brought no rope, no bridle, no treats meant to bribe trust into existing faster than it naturally could. She brought only her presence, offered without demand. Wrath watched her for hours. Sometimes he grazed, pretending not to notice her, the way a proud creature will pretend not to notice anything it has already decided matters. Sometimes he paced the far edge of the paddock, working off some old memory of pain that had nothing to do with her and everything to do with whoever had hurt him before he arrived on this land. She never approached. She let him choose the distance every single time, because choice was the entire foundation of what she was trying to rebuild in him. Late in the afternoon, Kale returned. He did not announce himself this time. He simply stood a distance away, arms folded, watching the strange stillness of the scene in front of him. A woman sitting silently in the dirt. A horse that had broken bones now standing calm, ears relaxed, 30 feet away from her, chewing grass, as if the morning's violence belonged to a different animal entirely. "You have not touched him," Kale said eventually. "I do not need to touch him yet," Nadia answered without turning. "Touch is the last step, not the first. Everyone who came before me tried to start there. That is most likely why he stopped believing that hands could ever mean anything except pain." Kale was quiet for a long moment. Then, in a voice that carried less command and more curiosity than anything he had said to her so far, he asked, "How do you know all of this?" "Because a very long time ago," she said, "I was the one flinching every time someone raised a hand near me. I know exactly what it looks like from the inside. It looks a great deal like what your horse is doing right now." She had not meant to say that much. It had simply come out, the truth arriving faster than her guard could stop it, and she felt an unfamiliar rush of exposure settle over her skin. She waited for him to press further, the way most people did, the instant they sensed a wound worth poking. He did not. He only nodded once, slowly, as if filing the information away somewhere private, and said nothing else. Then he turned and walked back toward the main house, leaving her alone with the horse and the long orange light of the falling sun. Nadia sat with that unfinished silence for a long while after he was gone, aware of something shifting quietly inside her, something she did not yet have language for, and was not entirely sure she wanted to find language for. She told herself it did not matter. She had a horse to save and a month to do it in, and a king's private history was none of her concern. She almost believed herself. That night, in the small guest cottage near the stables where she had been given a room, she lay awake listening to the wind moving through the trees outside, and she thought about the way Kale Draven had looked at Wrath, not with the disgust of a man who wanted a problem removed, but with the quiet ache of a man who saw something of himself in a creature everyone else had already given up on. She thought about how rare that kind of recognition was. She thought about how dangerous it might be, for both of them, if it turned out to run both directions. In the morning, she woke before sunrise and returned to the paddock fence with a cup of coffee she had not finished and a plan she had not fully formed. Wrath was already awake, standing near the fence line closer than he had stood the day before, watching her walk toward him with an expression she could only describe as cautious curiosity. She did not approach. She sat down at the same distance as the day before and simply waited. After several long minutes, Wrath took one slow step toward her, then another. It was the smallest possible beginning. It was, she knew, the only kind of beginning that could ever actually last. Behind her, unseen, a curtain in the upper window of the main house shifted slightly, and a man who had not slept properly and longer than he wanted to admit, watched the small, quiet miracle happening in his own backyard, and felt something in his chest loosen for the first time in longer than he could remember. Neither of them said a word about it, not yet. But something had already begun, in the space between a wounded horse and two people who had both spent their lives being far too good at hiding exactly how wounded they were themselves. 6 days passed before Wrath allowed Nadia to touch him for the first time, and when it finally happened, there was no fanfare, no dramatic music playing in the background of real life the way it might in a story. There was only a horse standing quietly in morning light, and a woman reaching out her hand slowly enough that he had a full 3 seconds to step away if he wanted to. He did not step away. Her fingers brushed the side of his neck, and he let out a breath so deep it seemed to come from somewhere far beneath his ribs, a breath that had been held for longer than either of them could measure. Nadia felt her own throat tighten unexpectedly. She had done this work for years, with dozens of animals, and it never stopped feeling like witnessing something sacred when a creature finally chose to believe that gentleness was real. She was not the only witness that morning. Cale had taken to appearing at the paddock fence nearly every day since their first conversation, always at a respectful distance, always with some flimsy excuse about needing fresh air or checking on estate matters that happened to require him to walk directly past the stables. Nadia had stopped pretending she believed the excuses. He had stopped pretending they were necessary. "That's the first time he's let anyone touch him since he arrived here," Cale said quietly, once Nadia had stepped back and Wrath had returned to grazing as if nothing remarkable had just occurred. "He let me touch him because I never asked him to trust me," she answered. "I only ever showed him I could be trusted. There's a difference most people never learn." Cale leaned against the fence rail, watching the horse with an expression she was beginning to recognize, a mixture of wonder and something heavier underneath it, something that looked almost like grief. "I bought him from a trader 2 territories east," he said. "The man told me he was simply a difficult animal, strong-willed. I did not learn the truth until after the sale was final. He had been beaten regularly by the previous owner, whenever he refused to be ridden past his limits. Beaten until he stopped refusing anything at all, and then beaten again when he stopped refusing. Because by then the previous owner had decided breaking him further was entertaining." Nadia felt her jaw tighten. She had heard versions of this story too many times in her career, and it never became easier to hear. "Some men mistake obedience purchased through fear for loyalty," she said. "It is never loyalty. It is only fear wearing loyalty's clothing, and it collapses eventually, usually in the worst possible moment for everyone involved." Cale was quiet for a long moment, watching Wrath's tail swish lazily in the morning air. "Is that why he attacked my men? Because he expected them to become the next version of the man who hurt him?" "Yes," Nadia said simply. "He was not being vicious. He was being accurate. Every human he had met before me had eventually proven that hands near his body meant pain was coming. I am only the first person patient enough to prove otherwise, slowly, one small choice at a time." Cale turned to look at her directly then, and there was something raw in his expression that she had not seen from him before, something that made her wonder exactly how much of what he had just described about the horse might also, quietly, be a description of something in himself. "How does a person learn patience like that?" he asked. "I have never had the luxury of it. Every decision I make affects thousands of people who depend on me to be decisive immediately, without hesitation, without the softness that your kind of work seems to require." "Patience is not the opposite of decisiveness," Nadia said. "It is the discipline underneath good decisiveness. Anyone can react quickly. It takes real strength to wait long enough to react correctly instead." He studied her for a long moment, as if turning that sentence over in his mind and testing its weight against everything he had believed about leadership his entire life. Finally, he said something she had not expected. "Would you teach me? Not the horsework specifically. The patience underneath it. Nadia had not anticipated the question, and for a moment she simply looked at him. This powerful, controlled, exhausted man asking a stranger to teach him something no one in his position was ever supposed to admit he lacked. It would have been easy to make a joke of it, to deflect the vulnerability sitting openly on the table between them. She chose not to. "I can show you what I do," she said. "Whether you learn the patience underneath it is entirely up to you. I cannot force it into you any more than I can force Wrath to trust faster than his own healing allows." He nodded slowly, and something settled in his shoulders that had not been there a moment before. A kind of relief that came from being told the truth instead of being flattered. The following days developed a quiet rhythm neither of them announced out loud, but both of them began to depend on. Nadia would arrive at the paddock before sunrise, and more often than not, Cale would already be there, standing at the fence with 2 cups of coffee, one of which he had started bringing for her without ever mentioning that he had noticed her habit of forgetting to eat breakfast when she was focused on her work. She noticed the gesture. She did not say anything about it either. Some kindnesses were better left unspoken, allowed to exist quietly in the space between 2 people who were both far more comfortable with silence than with naming feelings out loud. He began sitting on the ground beside her, at first with visible discomfort, a king unaccustomed to lowering himself onto dirt for any reason, and eventually with an ease that surprised even him. She taught him to be still. She taught him that stillness was not weakness, that the strongest presence in any room was often the one that did not need to prove anything by moving first. Wrath began approaching them both. Slowly at first, and then with something that could only be described as eagerness, the horse would walk directly to where they sat and lower his great head until his nose brushed against Cale's shoulder, and Nadia watched the first time it happened as something shifted permanently behind the king's storm-colored eyes. "He has never done that with anyone but you," Cale said, his voice unsteady in a way she had never heard from him. "He is not doing it because of me," Nadia answered gently. "He is doing it because you have finally shown him, day after day, that you are someone worth trusting. I only ever opened the door. You are the one who kept walking through it." Cale reached up and rested his hand against the horse's cheek, and something about the tenderness in that single gesture, coming from a man the entire territory believed to be unbending, made Nadia's chest ache in a way she was not prepared for. She began to notice things about him beyond the horse. The way he listened, really listened, when his advisors spoke, even when she suspected he already knew what they would say. The way his jaw tightened whenever someone mentioned his father, a detail she filed away without asking further, sensing there was history there too raw to press against yet. The way he laughed, rarely, but completely, in a manner that transformed his entire face into something younger and less burdened than the mask he wore for everyone else. She told herself she was simply observing him, the way she observed any animal she was working near, gathering information, understanding behavior patterns. She knew, somewhere honest inside herself, that this was not entirely true. One morning, nearly 2 weeks into her stay, Cale arrived at the paddock later than usual, and something in his posture told her immediately that the day carried weight beyond the ordinary. His shoulders were set too rigid, his jaw held too tight, and when he greeted her his voice lacked its usual steadiness. "My council convened last night," he said, without preamble. "They are unhappy that a stranger has been granted this much unsupervised access to me and to estate matters. They believe your presence here is a distraction from responsibilities I cannot afford to neglect." Nadia felt something cold settle in her stomach, though she kept her expression even. "And what do you believe?" He did not answer immediately. He watched Wrath graze in the pale morning light, and when he finally spoke, his voice was quiet in a way that made the words land harder than shouting ever could have. "I believe," he said, "that I have learned more about patience and trust and leadership in 2 weeks with you than I learned in 20 years surrounded by men who only ever taught me how to command. I believe my council is afraid of exactly the thing I am beginning to value most." Nadia's heart moved unevenly in her chest. She did not trust herself to speak, so she said nothing, and simply let the silence hold the moment the way she had taught him it could. They stayed like that for a long while, 2 people sitting quietly in the dirt beside a healing horse, neither one willing yet to name the thing growing steadily larger in the space between them, both of them entirely aware that naming it would change everything that came after. The council meeting happened 3 days later, and Nadia was not invited to attend, though she heard about it in fragments from the estate staff, who seemed to enjoy carrying gossip almost as much as they enjoyed avoiding actual work. A woman named Grace, who managed the kitchen and had taken a liking to Nadia over shared early morning coffee, found her near the stables afterward with an expression that suggested she was bursting with news she should probably not share. "They wanted him to send you away," Grace whispered, glancing over her shoulder as though the walls themselves might report back to someone important, an older man on the council. A man named Victor, who had served Kale's father before him, said outsiders had no place shaping the private character of a ruling king. He said it as though character was a fixed thing, finished at birth, incapable of growth. And what did Kale say? Nadia asked, keeping her voice carefully neutral, though her pulse had picked up considerably. Grace's eyes gleamed. He said character that cannot grow is not strength. It is stagnation wearing a crown, and he would rather rule imperfectly while still learning than rule perfectly while already finished becoming who he needed to be. Then he told Victor that your work with the horse would continue as planned, and so would your work with him. And if the council found that unacceptable, they were welcome to bring the matter to a formal vote, which he reminded them he would win, because he still remembered exactly which of them owed their positions to his father's mercy rather than their own merit. Nadia felt something warm move through her chest at the story, followed almost immediately by unease. Victories like that were rarely permanent. Men like Victor did not simply accept defeat and disappear quietly into obedience. They waited, and watched, and looked for a better moment to strike again from a different angle. She kept that unease to herself and returned to the paddock, where Wrath was waiting for her with the calm, familiar patience of a creature who had finally learned that mornings meant safety rather than uncertainty. She spent the day working with him on small exercises, walking beside her without a lead rope, responding to soft verbal cues instead of force. And by late afternoon he was following her voice alone across the length of the paddock, ears forward, entirely at ease. It was, by any measure, remarkable progress. She should have felt triumphant. Instead, she felt strangely hollow, aware that the closer she came to completing her actual assignment, the closer she came to the date when she would have no remaining reason to stay on this land at all. Kale found her sitting alone at the fence that evening, long after most of the staff had gone inside for the night. He carried no coffee this time, only a bottle of something dark and warm-looking, and 2 simple glasses, and he sat beside her without asking permission, which by now neither of them required from the other. "I heard about the council meeting," she said finally, when the silence had stretched long enough that someone needed to break it. "Of course you did," he said, with the faint trace of a tired smile. "This estate cannot keep a secret longer than an afternoon. Victor will not simply let this go," she said. "I have watched enough powerful men to recognize the type. He will find another angle." "He probably will," Kale agreed. "But that is a problem for tomorrow. Tonight I would rather sit here with you and the horse who used to hate me, and pretend, for one evening, that I am simply a man enjoying quiet company, instead of a king managing an endless list of threats." Nadia looked at him then, really looked, at the tired lines around his eyes that spoke of years spent holding a kingdom together through sheer will, and something in her chest ached with a tenderness she had been trying very hard not to acknowledge. "You are allowed to simply be a man sometimes," she said quietly. "Even kings are allowed that." He turned to look at her, and the space between them seemed to shrink without either of them physically moving closer. "Is that an offer?" he asked, his voice low, careful, giving her every opportunity to laugh it off if that was what she needed. She did not laugh it off. "I do not know what it is," she admitted honestly. "I only know that I have spent 2 weeks pretending I do not notice the way you look at me, and I am tired of pretending." Something shifted in his expression, relief and want and fear all moving across his features in the space of a single breath. "I have spent 2 weeks pretending the same thing," he said. "I told myself it was foolish. A king does not fall for the woman hired to fix his horse. It sounded absurd every time I said it to myself. And yet here I am, still saying it, and still meaning none of it. Neither of them moved first, and neither of them moved last. It simply happened, the way honest things often do, quietly and without announcement. His hand finding hers in the space between them, her head finding his shoulder in the cooling evening air. Wrath standing a short distance away, watching them both with the patient, knowing calm of a creature who understood exactly what quiet trust looked like, because he had learned it himself, one small choice at a time, from the very same woman. They did not speak of what it meant, not yet. Some things needed time to become real before they could survive being spoken aloud, and both of them, in their own ways, understood the value of patience better now than they ever had before. Above them, the stars had begun to appear, scattered and indifferent to the quiet, uncertain beginning happening beneath them. A beginning neither the horse, nor the man, nor the woman fully understood yet, but one that all 3 of them, in their own separate ways, had been waiting for far longer than any of them realized. The storm arrived without warning 3 nights later, rolling down from the northern hills faster than anyone on the estate had predicted, and by the time the first heavy rain began hammering the rooftops, every road leading off the property had already become impassable. Nadia had been walking back from the stables when the sky opened, and by the time she reached the main house, soaked through and shivering, the estate's communication lines had gone dark, cut somewhere along the ridge by a fallen tree nobody would be able to reach until the weather cleared. Most of the staff had already gone to stay with family in the nearby village before the roads closed, given the day off in anticipation of the storm. Grace had left a note apologizing for the empty kitchen. Owen, his arm still healing in a sling, had gone with her. By the time Nadia realized how thoroughly alone she and Cale now were on the sprawling estate, the wind outside had already grown loud enough to rattle the windows in their frames. Cale found her in the main hall, wrapped in a blanket someone had left by the fireplace, and something in his expression, half concern and half something warmer, made her stomach tighten pleasantly despite the circumstances. "It seems we are stranded together," he said, attempting lightness that did not quite mask the genuine worry underneath it. "I apologize for the inconvenience of my kingdom's weather. I have survived worse storms in worse company," she said, managing a small smile despite her chattering teeth. "Though I admit the company here is a considerable improvement." He built a fire in the main hearth himself, refusing the help she offered, insisting with a stubbornness that made her laugh that a king ought to know how to build a simple fire without assistance. When it finally caught, casting warm orange light across the room, he sat beside her on the thick rug in front of it, close enough that she could feel the warmth radiating from him alongside the fire's heat. They talked for hours that night, in a way neither of them had allowed themselves to before, protected by the storm's isolation and the strange freedom that came from having no meetings to attend and no counsel waiting outside the door. He told her about his father, a hard man who had ruled through fear and had taught Cale that softness was a weakness to be beaten out of himself before it could be exploited by enemies. He told her about the day his father died and the strange, guilty relief that had followed the grief, relief that he would never have to prove himself worthy of a love that had always been conditional. "I swore I would rule differently," he said, staring into the fire, "and then I built exactly the same walls my father built, because I did not know any other way to keep people from hurting me the way he had. I told myself the walls made me strong. I am beginning to suspect they only ever made me alone." Nadia listened without offering easy comfort, understanding instinctively that this was not a moment that needed fixing, only witnessing. When he finally finished speaking, she told him her own story in return, the version of herself she rarely shared with anyone. The childhood spent flinching at raised voices, the years spent learning that animals never lied about their feelings the way people sometimes did, the slow discovery that patience and stillness could heal wounds that force never could, in horses and in herself both. "I found the horses because I needed to learn something no person had ever managed to teach me," she admitted. "That trust could be rebuilt slowly, without demanding proof of safety before it was ever offered. Every time I watch a frightened animal choose to believe in gentleness again, some small part of me heals alongside it." Cale reached over and took her hand, his thumb tracing slow, careful circles against her palm, and the gesture held more tenderness than she had felt from another person and longer than she wanted to admit. "Then perhaps," he said quietly, "we have both spent our lives being far more like wrath than either of us realized." "Perhaps," she agreed softly. The fire crackled between them, filling the silence that followed with something warm and unhurried, and when he finally leaned toward her, slowly enough that she had every opportunity to pull away if she wanted to, she did not pull away. The kiss that followed was gentle at first, careful, as though both of them understood exactly how fragile this new, unnamed thing between them still was, and then it deepened into something that felt less like discovery and more like recognition. Two people finally arriving somewhere they had both been walking toward for weeks without admitting it. When they finally separated, breathless, the storm still raging outside the windows, Cale rested his forehead against hers and let out a long, unsteady breath. "I do not know what happens after tonight," he said honestly. "I do not know how a king explains this to a council that already distrusts you. I only know that I do not want tonight to be the only night." "It will not be," Nadia said, with a certainty that surprised even her. "Whatever comes next, we will face it the same way I taught you to face everything else. Slowly, patiently, together, instead of alone." He smiled then, a real smile, the rare kind that transformed his whole face, and pulled her closer against him, as the fire burned low, and the storm outside gradually began to quiet. Neither of them spoke of the council, or Victor, or the political complications that both of them, somewhere in the back of their minds, already knew were waiting for them once the roads reopened and the ordinary world came rushing back in. For that one night, wrapped in firelight and rain and the particular safety of being finally, completely known by another person, neither of them wanted to think about tomorrow at all. The roads reopened 4 days later, and with them came the ordinary world Kale had warned her about, arriving all at once and without mercy. Council members returned from wherever they had waited out the storm. Staff filed back into the estate carrying news and gossip from the village, and the quiet, private bubble that had held Nadia and Kale together through the storm burst the moment the first carriage rolled up the long drive. Nadia noticed the shift in him almost immediately, subtle but unmistakable, the way his shoulders squared, and his expression smoothed into the careful neutrality of a ruler with an audience. She understood it. She did not resent it, but she felt it, a small ache at watching the man from the fireside retreat back behind the mask the world required of him. Wrath, at least, remained unaffected by politics. He greeted her every morning at the fence with the same eager warmth he had been showing for weeks now, nudging her shoulder with his great head, following her voice across the paddock without hesitation. By any professional measure, her work was essentially complete. The horse who had broken bones 2 months earlier now stood calmly for grooming, accepted a saddle without protest, and walked beside handlers other than Nadia herself, provided they approached him with the patience she had spent weeks teaching them. It was Grace who told her about the meeting, 3 days after the roads reopened, finding her in the kitchen garden with an expression that immediately made Nadia's stomach drop. "You should know," Grace said carefully, glancing around before continuing in a lowered voice, "that Victor brought something before the council this morning. An old agreement, made by Kale's father years before he died, promising an alliance marriage to the neighboring territory once Kale came of age to rule alone. It was set aside for years because the timing never seemed urgent. Victor is arguing the timing has become urgent now, given what he called concerning influences on the king's judgment." Nadia felt something cold settle deep in her chest, spreading outward until her hands had gone numb around the basket she was holding. "Concerning influences meaning me," she said quietly. Grace's expression was answer enough. Nadia did not confront Kale that evening. She told herself she was waiting for him to bring it up himself, waiting to see whether he would choose honesty over the easier silence that powerful men so often preferred when difficult truths threatened their comfort. She waited the following evening as well, and the one after that, and each night he arrived at the paddock fence looking more exhausted and more distant than the night before, offering apologies about council matters that kept him occupied without ever once mentioning the specific matter occupying him. By the end of the week, the silence between them had grown loud enough that she could no longer ignore it. She found him alone in his study late one evening, papers scattered across his desk, his expression drawn and pale in the lamplight. He looked up when she entered, and something guilty flickered across his face before he could hide it, confirming everything Grace had already told her. "Grace mentioned an arrangement," Nadia said, keeping her voice steady though her heart was pounding. "An alliance marriage. Your father's agreement. I have been waiting for you to tell me about it yourself, and instead I have been hearing about my own life from kitchen staff for a week." Kale's jaw tightened, and for a long moment he said nothing, which told her more than any explanation could have. "It is complicated," he finally said. "The agreement was made before I understood what it meant. My father believed it would secure peace along our eastern border for a generation. I have spent the last week trying to find a way to undo it without triggering the very conflict it was meant to prevent." "And you did not think I deserved to know this while you searched," she said, her voice cracking slightly despite her effort to keep it level. "I did not want to burden you with something I had not yet solved," he said, and even as the words left his mouth she could see him recognizing how hollow they sounded. "That is not your decision to make for me," she said, anger and hurt tangling together in her chest until she could barely separate them. "You do not get to decide which truths I am strong enough to carry. I have spent my entire life being underestimated by people who thought protecting me meant keeping me in the dark. I did not expect that from you." Kale stood, moving toward her, but she stepped back before he could reach her, and something in that small physical retreat seemed to wound him more deeply than any words could have. "Nadia," he said, "please, let me explain." "You have had a week to explain," she said quietly. "I think that says everything I need to know about how much explaining you actually intended to do." She left the study before he could respond, her hands trembling as she walked the long corridor back toward the guest cottage, and she did not look back to see whether he followed. He did not. Whether out of respect for the space she clearly needed, or out of his own guilt keeping him rooted in place, she could not say, and in that moment, she found she did not particularly care which. That night, for the first time since her arrival, she did not go to the stables before dawn. She lay awake instead, staring at the ceiling of the small cottage, listening to the wind moving through the trees outside, and thought about every warning she had ever given herself about falling for men who occupied worlds far larger and more complicated than her own. She had ignored every one of those warnings. She was beginning to understand exactly why she should not have. By morning, she had made a decision, and she did not allow herself the luxury of reconsidering it once it had settled into place. She packed her bag before sunrise, moving quietly through the small cottage, folding clothes she had barely worn since arriving, gathering the few notes and training records she had kept on Rath's progress for whichever handler would take over his care once she was gone. Her hands moved with practiced efficiency, even as her chest ached with every item she placed inside the bag, each one a small confirmation that she was actually leaving, actually walking away from something that had grown far larger than she had ever intended it to become. She went to the paddock one final time before calling for transportation off the estate. Rath was waiting for her at the fence, as he always was now, ears forward, entirely unaware that anything had changed. She rested her forehead against his warm neck for a long moment, breathing in the familiar smell of hay and horse and morning air, and felt tears she had been holding back all night finally slip free. "You did not need me the way I thought you did," she whispered against his neck. "You only needed someone to prove that gentleness was real. He can give you that now, if he chooses to keep showing up the way I taught him." Rath nudged her shoulder gently, as if he understood something of what she was saying, and she allowed herself one more minute simply standing there with him, before she forced herself to step back and walk away. Grace found her near the front gate, waiting for the transport she had arranged the night before, and the older woman's face crumpled with genuine sorrow when she realized what was happening. "You cannot simply leave," Grace said, gripping Nadia's arm gently. "He has not slept properly in a week. He has been like a man carrying a mountain on his shoulders. Whatever happened between you, please, do not let Victor and an old piece of paper decide the rest of this story." "It is not about the paper," Nadia said quietly, though her voice wavered as she said it. "It is about being told what I could and could not handle knowing, by someone I trusted to be honest with me. I cannot build anything real with a person who decides which truths I am strong enough to carry." Grace's eyes were wet, but she nodded slowly, understanding even as she clearly wished the situation were different. "Then I hope, wherever you go, he finds the courage to prove you wrong about him before it is too late for both of you." The transport arrived, and Nadia climbed inside without looking back toward the main house. Though every part of her wanted desperately to see whether Cale would appear at a window, or come running down the drive, or do any of the things people did in the stories she had never quite believed happened in real life. He did not appear. The house remained still and silent behind her, as the carriage pulled away down the long drive, and she told herself the ache in her chest was simply the ordinary pain of an ending, nothing more complicated than that. Cale, in fact, had watched the entire departure from his study window, standing frozen at the glass with a piece of paper crumpled in his fist, a piece of paper that represented the formal dissolution of his father's old alliance agreement, a document he had spent 6 sleepless nights negotiating through back channels with the neighboring territory's own reluctant ruler, who, as it turned out, had no more interest in an arranged marriage than Cale did. He had finished the negotiations only hours before Nadia's carriage disappeared down the drive, and by the time he had gathered himself enough to go to her, to explain, to show her the proof of exactly what he had been doing during that terrible silent week instead of simply telling her, she was already gone. He stood at that window for a long time after the carriage vanished from sight, the crumpled paper still clutched in his hand, and felt something in his chest hollow out in a way that reminded him uncomfortably of the years following his father's death, the particular loneliness of having built walls so effective that even the people trying to love him could not find their way past them in time. Victor found him there an hour later and made the mistake of looking pleased about it. "I understand the trainer has left," Victor said, with the careful satisfaction of a man who believed he had won something important. "Perhaps now you can focus on matters that actually concern the future of this kingdom." Cale turned to face him slowly, and something in his expression made Victor's satisfaction falter immediately. "The alliance agreement is dissolved," Cale said, his voice quiet and cold in a way Victor had rarely heard from him. "I finished the negotiations myself, 6 days ago, without your help and without your knowledge, because I did not trust you to manage it honestly. The border peace you claim to be protecting will hold regardless, because the neighboring territory's ruler wanted out of the arrangement as badly as I did, and was relieved to discover I felt the same way." Victor's expression shifted from confusion to alarm. "Then why," he asked carefully, "did the trainer leave?" Cale's jaw tightened, and the paper in his fist crumpled further under the pressure of his grip. "Because I made the same mistake my father always made," he said quietly. "I decided, without asking her, what she was strong enough to handle knowing. I have spent my entire life believing that protecting people meant controlling what they were told, and I very nearly cost myself the one thing I have wanted for longer than I have wanted anything, because I could not unlearn that lesson quickly enough. Victor had no response to that, and for once in his long, calculating career, he had the good sense to remain silent. Cale stayed at the window a long while longer, watching the empty drive where the carriage had disappeared, and slowly, deliberately, he began to make a different kind of decision than the ones his father had ever taught him to make. Not a decision about kingdoms or alliances or council politics. A decision about what kind of man he still had time to become, if he was brave enough to go and prove it. Montana looked exactly the same as it always had when Nadia returned to it. The same wide sky, the same familiar smell of pine and cold earth, the same small ranch house she had grown up dreaming of leaving and had eventually come home to anyway, because some things about a place never really let go of a person no matter how far they traveled. She told herself the familiarity would help. Mostly, it simply made the silence louder. She threw herself into work the way she always had whenever her personal life became too complicated to sit still inside. Within 2 weeks of returning, she had taken on 3 new clients, difficult animals with difficult histories, the kind of work that used to feel like purpose and now simply felt like motion, a way of keeping her hands busy so her mind would not wander somewhere she had forbidden it to go. It did not work particularly well. Every horse she worked reminded her of wrath. Every quiet morning spent earning an animal's trust reminded her of quiet mornings at a paddock fence with 2 cups of coffee, one of which had always been prepared exactly the way she liked it without her ever having to ask. Her closest friend, a woman named Sophie who ran the ranch 2 properties over and had known Nadia since childhood, noticed the difference immediately, the way old friends always seem to notice the things a person tried hardest to hide. "You have been home a month," Sophie said one evening, sitting across from Nadia at the kitchen table with 2 mugs of tea neither of them had touched. "You have not once mentioned the job you took, and you always talk about your jobs. What happened over there?" "Nothing happened," Nadia said, too quickly, and Sophie's raised eyebrow told her exactly how unconvincing that answer had been. Sophie did not press immediately. She simply waited, the way good friends knew how to wait, until eventually the whole story came spilling out anyway. The horse, the king, the storm, the silence, the departure, all of it arriving in a rush that left Nadia feeling raw and strangely lighter for having said it out loud finally. "So let me understand this correctly," Sophie said when she had finished. "You met a man who learned actual patience from watching you work, who built a fire for you during a storm, who spent 6 sleepless nights secretly ending an arranged marriage rather than simply telling his advisors to accept it, and you left because he took a week too long to explain what he was doing." "When you put it that way," Nadia said quietly, "it sounds foolish." "It does not sound foolish," Sophie said gently. "It sounds like a woman who has been hurt before by people who decided things for her without asking, protecting her own heart the only way she knows how. That is not foolish, but it might be worth asking yourself whether the man who hurt you this time is actually the same as the people who hurt you before, or whether you are punishing him for a pattern he has not actually repeated as badly as you fear he has." Nadia did not have an answer for that, and the question followed her long after Sophie had gone home for the night, sitting with her in the quiet dark of her own kitchen, refusing to let her rest. 6 weeks after her return, a letter arrived at the ranch, carried by a rider she did not recognize, sealed with wax bearing a crest she recognized immediately despite herself. Her hands trembled slightly as she opened it, and inside she found not the grand declaration she might have expected from a king, but something far simpler, and somehow far more affecting because of that simplicity. It was a single page, written in Cale's own hand rather than dictated to some formal scribe. It said only that the alliance agreement had been dissolved 6 days before her departure, and enclosed the formal documentation as proof, dated and signed and witnessed, undeniable evidence of exactly what he had spent that terrible silent week actually doing. It said that he understood why she left, and that he would not ask her to forgive the silence, only to know the truth of what had filled it. It said that Wrath asked after her every single morning, standing at the fence and watching the drive as though still expecting her return, and that some mornings, Cale admitted, he found himself standing there too, for exactly the same reason. It did not ask her to come back. It did not demand anything of her at all. It simply told the truth, finally, the way she had asked him to from the very beginning, and left the rest entirely in her hands. Nadia read the letter 4 times that evening, and then a 5th time the next morning, and found that each reading loosened something in her chest that she had been holding tightly closed since the night she left his study. She had wanted honesty. He had finally given it to her, 6 weeks too late for it to undo the hurt of the silence, but not too late perhaps, to mean something all the same. She did not write back immediately. She sat with the letter for several more days, turning it over in her mind alongside Sophie's question, alongside every memory of firelight and quiet mornings and a horse who had taught both of them, in his own patient way, that trust rebuilt slowly was worth more than trust given too easily. On the 7th day, she finally took out a piece of paper of her own and began to write. The reply Nadia sent was shorter than the letter that had prompted it, and far more careful, because she had learned enough about herself in 6 weeks of quiet reflection to know exactly what she needed to say, and exactly what she still was not ready to promise. She thanked him for the honesty, finally offered instead of assumed unnecessary. She told him she believed the alliance had genuinely ended the way he described, and that she no longer carried anger about the silence itself, only the old, familiar wound it had accidentally reopened. She told him that trust, as he well knew from long mornings at a paddock fence, could not be rebuilt through a single letter, however honest, and that she was not yet ready to say what came next, only that she was willing to keep the door open rather than close it entirely. She did not receive a response for nearly 2 weeks, and in the silence that followed, she found herself oddly unafraid, understanding somehow that his restraint was not the old pattern of withholding, but something closer to respect, giving her exactly the space she had asked for, without pushing further than she had invited him to push. When the second letter finally arrived, it was accompanied by something unexpected, a small, carefully wrapped package that turned out to contain a single photograph, taken at sunrise, showing Wrath at full gallop across the northern paddock, mane flying, powerful and free in a way that would have been unthinkable months earlier. On the back, in Cale's familiar hand, was written a short note. He runs like this every morning now. He still looks toward the gate first, as if checking whether you might be arriving. I have started doing the same thing, and I no longer pretend to myself that it is about the horse. Nadia sat with that photograph for a long time, tracing the image of the horse she had grown to love, remembering the terrified, wounded creature who had thrown Owen through the air on her very first morning on that estate, and feeling something settle firmly into place inside her chest, a decision she had been circling for weeks finally arriving with full clarity. She wrote back within the hour this time, and what she wrote was simple. She told him she was coming, not because of the letters, and not entirely because of the photograph, though both had certainly helped, but because she had spent 6 weeks testing whether the version of him she remembered was real, or whether distance had simply made memory kinder than truth. The letters, patient and honest and unhurried, had answered that question for her. She told him to expect her within the fortnight, and she told him, in words she had never said to another person before, that she hoped whatever waited for them next would be built the same way Wrath's trust had been built, slowly, honestly, one small choice at a time, without either of them ever again deciding for the other what truths were safe enough to share. She arrived at the estate on a cool morning nearly identical to the one on which she had first come, though everything about the arrival felt entirely different this time. There was no screaming from the north paddock, no injured stable hand, no terrified horse rearing against a fence. There was only quiet and morning light and Cale himself, waiting at the gate rather than sending anyone else to greet her, dressed simply, looking somehow both more tired and more at peace than she had ever seen him. Neither of them said anything grand. There was no speech prepared, no declaration rehearsed for the moment, only 2 people standing several feet apart, each one waiting to see what the other would do first, exactly the way Wrath had once waited at a careful distance to see whether trust was actually safe to extend. I finished dissolving Victor's influence on the council 2 weeks ago, Cale said finally, the words coming out simpler than she expected. He resigned, once it became clear his schemes would no longer be tolerated quietly. I am not telling you this to prove anything. I am telling you because I promised myself I would never again decide for you which truths belonged in your hands versus mine. Nadia felt something in her chest loosen fully for the first time in 2 months. Thank you, she said quietly, for remembering that promise even when I was not here to remind you of it. He took one careful step closer, watching her face for any sign that she wanted him to stop, and when she did not give him one, he closed the remaining distance between them and rested his forehead gently against hers, the same gesture he had offered the night of the storm, months earlier now, though it felt both entirely familiar and entirely new. I did not come back for the horse, Nadia admitted softly. Wrath was going to be fine either way. He had already learned everything he needed to learn. I know exactly why you came back, Cale said, and there was no arrogance in the words, only a quiet, humble certainty that had not existed in him during their first meeting all those months ago. I have spent every morning since you left learning the same patience I once asked you to teach me, hoping I would eventually become the kind of man worth this particular kind of trust. From somewhere behind them, near the paddock fence, Wrath let out a low, contented sound, and both of them turned to see him standing at the gate, watching the two humans he had grown to trust more than any others in his long, difficult life. His ears relaxed, his powerful body calm and unafraid. He walked slowly toward them, the way he always had once he decided a distance was finally safe enough to close, and stopped directly between the two people standing at the gate, resting his great head first against Nadia's shoulder, and then, just as gently, against Kale's. Neither of them said anything else for a long while. They did not need to. Some understandings did not require words at all, only the quiet, patient proof of showing up, again and again, until trust became something solid enough to stand on. The morning light grew warmer around them, and somewhere in the distance a bell rang softly across the estate, calling the ordinary business of the day forward the way it always had. But for a little while longer, none of the three of them moved, content simply to stand together in the quiet, having finally arrived at the place all of them, in their own patient ways, had been walking toward from the very beginning. Settling into life on the estate was slower and stranger than Nadia had expected, not because anything was wrong, but because happiness, she discovered, required its own kind of patience, the same careful, unhurried trust she had spent months teaching a wounded horse and a guarded king. She kept her small ranch in Montana rather than selling it, an arrangement Cale had suggested himself, understanding without needing lengthy explanation that a woman who valued honesty above comfort would also value having somewhere entirely her own to return to if she ever needed it. She did not need it often, but knowing it existed made everything else feel less like surrender and more like choice, renewed freely each morning rather than owed out of obligation. The estate staff welcomed her differently than they had the first time. Grace hugged her so tightly upon her return that Nadia laughed for the first time in what felt like months, and Owen, his arm fully healed now, insisted on personally showing her every improvement made to the stables during her absence, as though presenting gifts to someone whose good opinion genuinely mattered to him. The council proved more complicated, though considerably less dangerous without Victor's quiet scheming steering it from the shadows. Some members remained skeptical of a horse trainer from a distant territory holding this much of the king's private trust, and Nadia did not pretend their skepticism did not sting occasionally. But she had built her entire career on winning trust from creatures who had every reason to withhold it, and she approached the council with the same patient, unhurried honesty that had worked on every difficult animal she had ever met. Slowly, one conversation at a time, most of them came around. A few never fully did, and Nadia learned, with Cale's steady support beside her, that this was simply a truth she could live alongside, rather than a problem requiring an immediate solution. There were harder days too, days when old fears resurfaced without warning, when Cale's schedule pulled him away for weeks handling border disputes or trade negotiations, and Nadia found herself alone in a place still unfamiliar enough to feel lonely in his absence. On one particularly difficult evening, nearly 4 months after her return, she found herself standing at the paddock fence long after dark, unable to sleep, turning over old doubts that refused to stay quiet no matter how much progress had been made. Cale found her there, having returned from a 3-week negotiation earlier than expected specifically because he had sensed, even from a distance, that something in her most recent letters had sounded quieter than usual. "You came back early," she said, surprised, when he appeared beside her at the fence. "I finished what needed finishing," he said simply, "and then wanted to come home." Home, she noticed, and not the estate, not this land, but simply home, spoken as though the word had come to mean something different to him since she had arrived, something built around a person rather than a place. She told him honestly about the doubts that had crept back in during his absence, the old fear that she would always be somewhat foreign here, tolerated rather than truly belonging, useful for what she had fixed rather than valued for who she actually was. He listened without interrupting, the way she had taught him to listen months earlier, and when she finished, he did not rush to reassure her with easy words. Instead, he took her hand and led her quietly toward the stables, where Wrath stood dozing peacefully in his stall, and beside him, in the neighboring enclosure, a young mare Nadia did not recognize, clearly pregnant, clearly cared for with meticulous attention. "I purchased her 2 months ago, from the same trader who originally sold me Wrath," Cale explained. She had been treated the same way he had, and the trader was eager to be rid of an animal he considered equally difficult. "I did not tell you because I wanted to see whether I could actually apply what you taught me without you standing beside me the entire time. I have been working with her every single morning since." Nadia stared at him, and then at the mare, who regarded them both with cautious but unafraid curiosity, clearly further along in her healing than any newly rescued animal had any right to be without expert guidance. "You did this yourself," she said quietly, something in her chest swelling with a pride she had not expected to feel this deeply. "I did this because of you," he corrected gently. "Everything I know about patience I learned at that fence, from a woman who never once let me believe love or trust could be rushed into existing before they were ready. I wanted to prove to myself, and to you, that what you built in me was not temporary. It was not simply borrowed from your presence, it became mine to keep, and to use, long after you were not standing beside me reminding me how." Nadia felt tears gather unexpectedly at the corners of her eyes, and she did not bother hiding them. "This is not what foreign, tolerated, or merely useful looks like," she said softly. "This is what belonging looks like, even if it took me longer than it should have to see it clearly." Cale pulled her gently against him, resting his chin against the top of her head, and for a long while neither of them spoke, simply standing together in the quiet stable, listening to the soft, contented sounds of two healing horses breathing steadily in the dark, proof enough of everything words could never quite fully capture. A year passed the way meaningful years often do, quietly at first and then, looking back, astonishingly full, measured less by grand events than by small, accumulated mornings that had slowly built into an entire life neither Nadia nor Cale could imagine living any other way. The mare Cale had rescued gave birth in early spring, a healthy foal with her mother's dark coat and, Nadia noted with quiet amusement, Wrath's particular stubborn confidence already visible in the way the small creature refused to be hurried into anything it was not ready for. They named her Patience, a choice so obvious once suggested that neither of them could remember afterward who had said it first, only that it had felt immediately, unmistakably correct. Nadia's work expanded gradually, first to horses across Cale's own territory whose owners had heard whispers of the trainer who had transformed Wrath from a broken, violent animal into the calm, powerful horse he had become, and eventually to neighboring territories as well, as her reputation traveled the way reputations always did, faster and further than she ever expected. She insisted on continuing the work herself, refusing offers to simply oversee others doing it in her place, because she had learned long ago, and had never once stopped believing, that some things could not be taught secondhand. They had to be lived, patiently, one honest choice at a time. Cale's rule steadied alongside her own quiet growth. The council reshaped gradually around advisors who valued exactly the kind of patient, considered leadership he had grown into, rather than the fear-based command his father had once taught him, was the only strength available to a king. Victor's departure, once feared as a dangerous political upheaval, had settled quietly into little more than a footnote in the estate's longer, better history, proof that some threats loomed largest only in anticipation, and shrank considerably once finally faced directly. On a warm evening in early autumn, exactly 1 year to the day since Nadia had first climbed over a fence to help an injured stable hand and an enraged, terrified horse, Cale led her out to the same paddock where all of it had begun. Wrath grazed peacefully nearby, older now, calmer, utterly transformed from the animal who had once broken bones out of pure, desperate fear. Patience, the young foal, trotted circles around her mother a short distance away, full of the reckless energy of a creature who had never once in her short life needed to learn that hands could mean harm. Cale did not make a lengthy speech. He had never been a man built for lengthy speeches, and Nadia had never needed one from him. He simply took her hand, the same careful, deliberate way he had taken it the night of the storm, and told her, in words as simple and honest as anything he had ever said to her, that he did not want to spend one more year measuring his life by council meetings and border negotiations, without also measuring it, permanently and officially, by the presence of the woman who had taught him everything he actually valued about being a leader worth following. Nadia did not need lengthy words either. She simply said yes, watching the last of the autumn light catch gold across the paddock, watching Wrath lift his head briefly to observe the two humans standing quietly together at the fence where he had first learned what safety actually felt like, before lowering it again to graze, entirely unbothered, entirely at peace. They were married the following spring, in a small ceremony held at that same paddock rather than the grand hall the council had initially proposed, surrounded by staff who had become something closer to family than employees, by Sophie who traveled from Montana specially for the occasion, by Grace who cried through the entire event and pretended afterward that she had not. Wrath stood calmly at the fence throughout the ceremony, Patience beside him, both horses seemingly aware, in whatever way animals understood such things, that something important and lasting was being celebrated in the place where their own healing had first quietly begun. Years later, when people asked Nadia how she had ever managed to tame a horse everyone else had given up on, and, inevitably, how she had also somehow tamed a king known throughout every territory for his unbending will, She always gave the same simple answer, the one she had believed from the very first morning she sat in the dirt of that paddock and waited, patiently, for trust to arrive entirely on its own terms. She had never tamed anything at all, she told them. Taming was never the point, and it had never once been what either of them, horse or king, actually needed. All she had ever done was wait long enough, and gently enough, for something wounded to remember on its own that safety was real, and that some kinds of strength were built not from walls, but from the quiet, patient courage it took to finally let them down.